fired and walking home, until Millionaire landed shouting, "Where's the nurse?" The shocking event. The crystal chandeliers of the Thorne estate did not twinkle. They glared. Thousands of tiny cut glass eyes stared down at the 300 guests navigating the ballroom below. It was the annual Thorne Foundation Gala, a night where charity was measured in diamonds and compassion was served in crystal flutes. The air smelled of expensive perfume, old money, and the metallic tang of cold ambition. Julian Thorne stood at the center of it all, a dark anchor in a sea of sequins. At 30 years old, the CEO of Thorne Global Security looked less like a host and more like a statue carved from obsidian. His tuxedo was tailored to a fraction of an inch, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes, cold, calculating, and blue, scanned the room for threats rather than friends. He checked his watch. The heavy gold Rolex felt like a shackle. "He needs to be down here, Julian," Isabella Vane hissed, her voice low and sharp, hidden behind a pristine, whitened smile. She hooked her arm through his, her fingernails digging slightly into the fabric of his suit. Isabella was beautiful in the way a marble floor is beautiful. Flawless, hard, and cold to the touch. The board is watching. The investors are whispering. They think you're hiding a defective child. Julian stiffened. "He's not defective, Isabella. He's grieving." "He's 6, she countered, waving at a senator's wife. "He's been grieving for 3 years. It's bad PR. Bring him down for the photo op or the stock drops. It's simple math." Julian signaled the head of security with a barely perceptible nod. He hated this. He hated the noise, the pretense, and the fact that he was about to drag his son into the lion's den. But Julian was a man who solved problems with force and logic. He believed exposure therapy was efficient. He was wrong. Upstairs, in the nursery that felt more like a sterile hospital ward than a child's bedroom, Leo Thorne sat curled in the corner. He was a small, fragile thing, trembling in a miniature tuxedo that scratched his sensory-sensitive skin. He covered his ears, rocking back and forth. The muffled bass of the orchestra downstairs sounded like monsters thumping against the floorboards. When the security guard opened the door, Leo flinched. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken a word since the car crash that took his mother. 10 minutes later, the ballroom doors swung open. A hush fell over the crowd as Julian walked in, gripping Leo's small, sweating hand. The boy looked like a ghost, pale and wide-eyed, overwhelmed by the assault of lights, smells, and staring faces. "Smile, Leo," Isabella whispered, leaning down. Her perfume was overpowering, a sickly sweet cloud of jasmine. She grabbed his shoulder, her grip tight. "Look at the camera. Stop shaking." The flashbulbs erupted. Pop, pop, pop. To Leo, they weren't lights. They were explosions. The room spun. The chatter of the guests warped into a deafening roar. The texture of the wool suit felt like needles. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The scream didn't sound human. It was a guttural, high-pitched wail of pure, primal terror that shattered the polite ambiance of the gala. Leo ripped his hand from Julian's grip and threw himself onto the floor, thrashing. He knocked over a tray of champagne, the glass shattering around him. The guests gasped, stepping back in horror as if the boy were contagious. "Get him up!" Isabella hissed, her face flushing red. "Julian, do something! He's embarrassing us!" Julian froze. He reached out, his hands hovering. "Leo, stop, stand up, it's okay." But his voice was devoid of warmth. It was a command, not a comfort. He didn't know how to touch his own son without making it worse. Then, the service doors exploded open. She didn't look like she belonged there. Sarah Evans wore faded blue scrubs and a gray zip-up hoodie. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore zero makeup. She was the anomaly in the room of high fashion. She had been ordered to stay in the kitchen, invisible, but she had heard the scream. She didn't walk, she ran. She ignored the billionaires, the socialites, and the security guards. She slid onto her knees on the polished marble floor, oblivious to the broken glass slicing into her scrub pants. "Leo!" Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos. It was grounded, earthy, and warm. The boy was hyperventilating, clawing at his necktie. Julian watched, paralyzed, as this woman, his employee, someone whose name he barely remembered, did what he couldn't. She didn't grab the boy. She didn't shout. She lowered her head to the floor, making herself smaller than him. She placed one hand flat on the ground and the other on her own chest. She started to hum. It was a low, rhythmic vibration, a melody without words. Leo froze. His wild eyes locked onto hers. "I'm here," Sarah whispered, her eyes locked on the boy, ignoring the hundreds of people judging her. "Match my breathing, Leo. Just look at me. The noise is gone. It's just us. Just us." She began a rhythmic tapping on her own collarbone. Tap, tap, tap. Leo's trembling hand reached out. He mimicked her. Tap, tap, tap. The screaming stopped. The thrashing ceased. The boy crawled across the glass-strewn floor and collapsed into Sarah's arms, burying his face in the cheap cotton of her hoodie. He sobbed, but it was a release, not a panic. She wrapped him up tight, rocking him, shielding him from the cameras, from Isabella, and from his father. The ballroom was dead silent. Julian Thorne stood above them, his hands still uselessly suspended in the air. He looked at Isabella, who was furiously wiping champagne off her dress, and then down at the nurse. Sarah looked up at him then. Her eyes were fierce, protective, blazing with an anger that no employee should dare show a billionaire. "He is not a prop," she whispered, the words carrying like a gunshot in the silence. "He is a child, and he is done for the night." She didn't wait for permission. She scooped the 6-year-old into her arms. He was too heavy for her, but adrenaline gave her strength and carried him out of the room. Julian watched them go. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a cracking in the ice. For the first time in 3 years, he realized he was the poorest man in the room. The investigation and the bond. The days following the gala were different. The house, usually a cavern of echoing silence, felt charged with a new, quiet energy. Julian Thorne was a man of data. When a system failed in his company, he investigated the root cause. His parenting had failed publicly and catastrophically. The variable that had stabilized the system was Sarah Evans. He began to watch. From the high-tech sanctuary of his office, surrounded by screens displaying global stock markets and defense contracts, Julian dedicated one monitor to the internal security feed of the nursery wing. It started as a way to ensure Leo's safety, but it quickly became an obsession. He saw things he had never witnessed in person. He saw Sarah turn the sterile nursery into a magical fortress using nothing but bedsheets and flashlights. He watched as she sat on the floor for hours, literally hours, just reading books in soft, funny voices, doing different accents for each character. He saw Leo, the boy who never smiled, cover his mouth to stifle a giggle when Sarah pretended to be a clumsy dragon. It wasn't medical care. It was alchemy. One rainy Tuesday evening, Julian returned home late. The mansion was dark, save for the kitchen light. He walked in, loosening his tie, expecting to find the private chef or the housekeeper. Instead, he found Sarah. She was sitting at the massive marble island, looking exhausted. She had a mug of tea in her hands and was staring blankly at the wall. She was still in her scrubs, her hair messy. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Mr. Thorne, I apologize. I was just..." The storm kept Leo up. "I needed some tea before I went to my room." Julian waved a hand, signaling her to sit. "Sit down, Ms. Evans, please." He walked to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of sparkling water, and leaned against the counter opposite her. The distance between them was only a few feet, but the social gap was miles wide. "I watched the feed from today," Julian said, his voice low. Sarah stiffened. "I can explain the paint on the walls. It's water-soluble. I promise it will wash off," but Leo needed to express. "I'm not talking about the paint," Julian interrupted. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He noticed the fatigue under her eyes, but also the kindness that seemed etched into her features. "You got him to eat. He hasn't eaten a full meal in weeks." Sarah relaxed slightly, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. He doesn't like the texture of metal spoons. They're cold. I used a wooden one, and we made it a game. Every bite was fuel for his spaceship. Julian looked down at his water. I bought him a $2,000 telescope, and he never touched it. You used a wooden spoon. Children don't care about price tags, Mr. Thorne, Sarah said softly. They care about presence. He just needs to know someone is there. Someone who isn't going to leave. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Someone who isn't going to leave. Julian thought of his late wife. He thought of his own long hours at the office, his travel schedule, his inability to look his son in the eye because the boy looked so much like the woman he lost. You have a gift, Sarah, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She looked up, surprised. A flush of color rose to her cheeks. It's not a gift. It's just listening. Why do you do it? He asked. You're overqualified. You were a trauma nurse at City General. You could be running a department, yet you're here, dealing with my mess. Sarah hesitated. She looked down at her hands, scarred slightly from years of medical work. I lost my family 4 years ago. A drunk driver. Julian went still. I couldn't save them, she whispered, her voice steady but laced with old pain. I had all the training, all the equipment. It didn't matter. After that, the ER was too loud, too much death. Leo is full of life that's just stuck behind a wall. Helping him break through that wall. It helps me breathe, too. For a moment, the billionaire and the nurse were just two grieving people standing in a kitchen worth more than most houses. The silence wasn't awkward. It was shared. Julian felt a magnetic pull, an urge to reach out and touch her hand, to offer comfort, to bridge the gap. He took a half-step forward. Sarah, Julian? The sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. Isabella stood in the doorway. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than Sarah's annual salary. Her eyes darted from Julian's softened expression to Sarah's flushed face. She saw the intimacy of the scene, the late hour, the shared confidence, the lack of professional barriers. Isabella didn't yell. She didn't make a scene. She smiled, but it was a predator's smile. I was wondering where you were, Isabella purred, walking over to Julian and placing a possessive hand on his chest, marking her territory. She glanced at Sarah with cold dismissal. You can go now, nurse. We're done here. Sarah stood up immediately, grabbing her mug. Good night, Mr. Thorne. Miss Vane. She hurried out of the room, feeling the heat of Isabella's glare on her back. Julian watched her leave, feeling a sudden emptiness in the room. He looked at Isabella, who was tracing the lapel of his suit. She's quaint, Isabella said, her voice dripping with venom disguised as boredom. But really, Julian, staff in the kitchen at midnight. It's untidy. We really need to discuss the staffing arrangements before the wedding. Julian pulled away from her touch. She's helping Leo. That's all that matters. Of course, Isabella said, her eyes narrowing as she watched the empty doorway where Sarah had vanished. Helping Leo. But in her mind, the calculation was already done. The nurse wasn't just an employee anymore. She was a threat, and Isabella Vane did not tolerate threats. She would not let a woman in scrubs steal the empire she had worked so hard to marry into. The trap would have to be set quickly, and it would have to be unforgivable. The sabotage and the separation. The atmosphere in the Thorne mansion shifted 3 days later. It wasn't the weather. Though the sky outside had turned a bruised, sullen purple, threatening a deluge, it was the silence. It was the calm before a very specific, calculated storm. Isabella Vane had been patient. She had watched Julian soften. She had seen the way his eyes lingered on the nursery door, not with dread, but with hope. She knew that hope was dangerous. It made him vulnerable. It made him look at a woman in blue scrubs as if she were a savior rather than a servant. Isabella stood in the master suite, holding a velvet box. Inside lay the Thorne sapphire, a brooch that had belonged to Julian's mother. It was worth $250,000, but its sentimental value was incalculable. It was the only object Julian had ever explicitly forbidden anyone to touch. With a gloved hand, she removed the brooch. She walked down the hall to the mudroom where the staff kept their personal belongings. Sarah's worn canvas tote bag sat on the bench. It was pathetic, really. Frayed at the edges, filled with paperback books and spare medical supplies. Isabella slipped the sapphire into the side pocket, burying it beneath a spare pair of socks. She checked her watch. Julian was due home in 10 minutes. When Julian walked through the double doors, shaking the first drops of rain from his umbrella, he walked into chaos. The staff was lined up in the foyer, heads bowed. Isabella was pacing, a theatrical display of distress, wiping tears from her eyes. "Julian?" She rushed to him, clutching his lapels. "It's gone! Your mother's brooch! The sapphire!" Julian went cold. The exhaustion of the business day evaporated, replaced by a sharp, icy anger. "What do you mean? Gone?" "I left it on the vanity to be cleaned. I turned around for 5 minutes," Isabella sobbed, playing the victim perfectly. "We've searched everywhere. The staff. I didn't want to accuse anyone, but—" "Search them," Julian ordered. His voice was a steel trap. "Search everything. Now." Frank, the head of security, looked uncomfortable. He liked Sarah. He had seen what she did for the boy, but an order was an order. "Mr. Thorne, we've cleared most of the house. The only area left is the staff personal storage." "Do it!" Julian snapped. Sarah was called down from the nursery. She looked confused, wiping paint from her hands onto her scrubs. "Is everything okay?" "Leo is just finishing his dinner. I didn't want to leave him." "Quiet!" Isabella snapped. Frank opened the canvas tote bag. He hesitated for a fraction of a second when his fingers brushed the cold metal of the jewelry, but he pulled it out. The sapphire caught the light of the chandelier, glittering damningly in his rough hand. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. No, I've never seen that before. I didn't take that." Julian stared at the brooch. Then he looked at Sarah. The connection they had built in the kitchen, the shared grief, the quiet respect, it all shattered under the weight of his oldest trauma. Betrayal. People wanted his money. Everyone wanted his money. He had been a fool to think she was different. "Julian, please." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes filling with tears. "I swear on my life. I swear on Leo's life. I would never steal from you. Someone put it there." "Who?" Isabella interjected smoothly, her voice laced with sad disappointment. "Who would do that, Sarah? The housekeeper? The chef? You're the only one with unchecked access to the upper floors. You used the boy to get close, and you took advantage of our trust." "I am not using him!" Sarah's voice rose, desperate. "I love him." "Enough," Julian whispered. It wasn't a shout, but it stopped the room. He looked at Sarah with eyes that were dead again. The father was gone. The CEO was back. "You're fired. Mr. Thorne, please. Leo wakes up in an hour. If I'm not there to do the transition—" "I said get out," Julian barked, the veneer cracking. "You have 5 minutes to gather your things. If you are not off my property, I will have the police escort you out in handcuffs. Consider yourself lucky I don't press charges immediately." Sarah looked at him, searching for the man she had spoken to in the kitchen. He wasn't there. She looked at Isabella, who offered a tiny, triumphant smirk that only Sarah could see. Defeated, Sarah nodded. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She walked to the bench, took her bag, minus the brooch, and packed her stethoscope and the framed photo of Leo she had kept on her makeshift desk. She walked out the front door. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her with a finality that shook the floorboards. Outside, the sky opened up. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. A storm of biblical proportions hammered the estate. Sarah had no car. Isabella had canceled the rideshare service on the house account. Sarah pulled her gray hoodie up, clutched her cardboard box against her chest to keep the photo dry, and began the long, dark walk down the driveway toward the highway. Inside the mansion, the clock struck 7 p.m. Upstairs, Leo Thorne woke up. He reached out for the hand that was always there. He grasped nothing but air. He sat up. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice rusty and unused. He waited. No answer. He climbed out of bed and ran to the hallway. "Sarah?" Silence. The panic didn't come slowly. It hit him like a physical blow. The safety anchor was gone. The world was loud, cold, and empty again. Leo screamed. The crisis and the truth. The sound coming from the nursery was not human. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap, gnawing off its own leg to escape. Julian was in his study, pouring a glass of scotch, trying to drown the strange guilt gnawing at his gut, when the screaming started. It wasn't the tantrum screaming of the gala. This was sheer, unadulterated terror. He dropped the glass. It didn't break on the rug, but the amber liquid stained the expensive wool. He ran. When he reached the nursery, the scene was a nightmare. Leo had torn the curtains from the walls. He had overturned the heavy oak bookshelf. He was currently curled in the center of the room, scratching at his own arms until they bled, banging his head rhythmically, violently, against the floorboards. "Leo, stop!" Julian lunged forward, trying to grab his son, but Leo fought him with the strength of the possessed. He bit Julian's hand, drawing blood, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was in a sensory hell loop. He needed the hum. He needed the tapping. He needed Sarah. "Get the sedative!" Isabella shrieked from the doorway, looking horrified, not for the boy, but for the mess. "No sedatives!" Julian roared, wrestling his son, pinning his arms to stop the self-harm. "Frank! Frank! Get in here!" Frank, the head of security, didn't appear. "Frank!" Julian bellowed. "I'm here, sir." Frank's voice came over the intercom, breathless. "But you need to come to the security room now. Leave the boy with the staff. You need to see this. Now." There was something in Frank's voice, a lack of deference, a raw urgency, that made Julian listen. He signaled for the two other guards to hold Leo gently using the restraint techniques Sarah had taught them. Julian sprinted down the hall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into the security room. Frank was standing by the main console, his face pale. "This better be good, Frank," Julian warned, his hands shaking. "I didn't think she did it," Frank said, his voice tight. "Sarah, it didn't sit right. She doesn't even wear jewelry. So I pulled the raw footage from the hallway cameras outside the mudroom. The motion sensors didn't trigger for Sarah. Show me." Frank hit a key. On the high-definition screen, the timestamp showed 5:45 p.m. The hallway was empty. Then Isabella walked into the frame. She wasn't crying. She looked calm, predatory. She held the velvet box. She checked over her shoulder, then slipped into the mudroom. She emerged 30 seconds later, empty-handed, checking her reflection in the mirror and smoothing her hair. Julian watched, the blood draining from his face. Then Frank switched the feed. "And this is 10 minutes ago. The perimeter cam." The screen showed the main gate. It was pitch black, the rain coming down in sheets of silver under the infrared lights. A small figure in a gray hoodie was walking along the side of the highway, head bowed against the wind, clutching a soggy cardboard box. She stumbled, fell to her knees in the mud, and got back up. She kept walking. Julian felt a physical sickness rise in his throat. He looked at the screen. The woman who had saved his son, walking into a dangerous storm, cast out like a criminal because of his own blindness. He looked at the other screen, his fiancée, the architect of this cruelty. He didn't just feel regret. He felt rage, a purifying, volcanic rage. "Where is she?" Julian demanded. "She's on Route 9, heading towards the city." "But sir, the storm, the roads are flooding. There's a flash flood warning. Traffic is gridlocked for 10 miles. You can't get to her by car." Julian looked at the monitor showing Leo's room, where his son was still screaming, a sound that tore at Julian's soul. He looked at Sarah, alone in the dark. "I'm not taking a car," Julian said. He grabbed his radio. "Prep the chopper, now." "Sir, the weather conditions are grounding commercial flights." The pilot's voice crackled back, hesitant. "I don't care about the regulations," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "This is a medical emergency extraction. We fly low. We fly now. Get the bird in the air." He didn't return to the nursery. He didn't speak to Isabella. He ran. He ran out into the storm, his expensive Italian loafers slipping on the wet tarmac of the helipad. The rotors of the Blackthorn security helicopter were already spinning, whipping the rain into a frenzy. Julian jumped in, not bothering with a headset, yelling at the pilot, "Route 9, find her!" The helicopter lifted, banking hard into the wind. Below, the world was a blur of grey and black. On the highway, the situation was dire. Cars were pulled over. The drainage ditches were overflowing. Sarah was soaked to the bone, her scrubs clinging to her shivering frame. She couldn't feel her fingers. She was crying, not because of the cold, but because she could still hear Leo's scream in her head. She had failed him. Above her, the rhythmic thwop-thwop-thwop of rotors cut through the thunder. A spotlight beamed down from the heavens, blindingly bright. It swept the road, illuminating the rain like falling diamonds. It passed her, then snapped back, pinning her in a circle of light. The helicopter hovered low, dangerously low, over the empty stretch of highway. The downdraft flattened the grass and whipped Sarah's hair around her face. She shielded her eyes, terrified, thinking it was the police. The side door of the helicopter slid open. Julian Thorne didn't wait for it to land. As the skids touched the wet asphalt, he leaped out. He was a man who usually worried about creases in his suit. Now he was sprinting through puddles, his tie flying over his shoulder, his hair plastered to his forehead. He ran toward her with a desperation that defied his status. Sarah froze, clutching her box. Julian closed the distance. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a man who had seen the edge of the abyss. He stopped 3 feet from her, breathless, rain dripping from his nose. "Sarah!" he screamed over the roar of the engine. She stepped back, trembling. "I didn't take it, I swear." "I know," Julian shouted back, his voice breaking. He reached out his hand, the same hand that had fired her an hour ago, now trembling with adrenaline and remorse. "I know you didn't. I saw the tape. It was her. I'm sorry." Sarah stared at him, the rain mingling with her tears. "Leo is screaming," Julian yelled, stepping closer, ignoring the mud splashing his trousers. "He won't stop. He needs you. I need you." He looked at her, wild-eyed and pleading. "Where is the nurse?" he shouted into the wind, repeating the question he had screamed at his security team moments ago, but now directing it at the universe. "Where is the woman who saved my son? Because she is the only thing that matters." He dropped to his knees on the wet highway, right in front of her. The billionaire knelt in the mud. "Please," he begged, looking up at her. "Come home." The redemption and the new beginning. The helicopter ride back to the estate was a blur of noise and vibration, but inside the cabin, there was a strange, heavy silence. Julian sat across from Sarah, his knees brushing against hers. He had stripped off his suit jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The navy wool, smelling of expensive cologne and rain, was the only thing stopping her teeth from chattering. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply watched her, his eyes wide and unblinking, tracking every shiver, every breath she took. The cold, impenetrable CEO was gone. In his place sat a man who had looked into the abyss of his own failure and had been granted a second chance. When the chopper touched down on the south lawn, the rotors hadn't even stopped spinning before Julian kicked the door open. He jumped out, turned, and offered his hand to Sarah. This time, he didn't wait for her to take it. He grabbed her hand firmly, interlacing their fingers, anchoring her to him. They ran toward the mansion. The staff had gathered by the French doors, alerted by the return of the aircraft. They watched in stunned silence as Mr. Thorne, soaked, muddy, his white dress shirt clinging to his chest, dragged the fired nurse back into the house as if she were the crown jewels. "Where is he?" Sarah gasped as they burst into the foyer, her medical instincts overriding her shock. "Upstairs," Julian said, not stopping. He led her up the grand staircase, leaving muddy footprints on the pristine white carpet. He didn't care. He would burn the carpet if he had to. They reached the nursery corridor. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic sobbing that was somehow worse. It was the sound of a child who had given up. Isabella was standing outside the door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of annoyed perfection. When she saw them, wet, dirty, and hand in hand, her expression curdled. "Julian!" she exclaimed, her voice shrill. "You cannot be serious. You brought the thief back. After she stole your mother's—" Julian didn't slow down. He didn't even look at her. He shoulder-checked his fiancée, pushing past her with enough force to make her stumble against the wall. "Get out of my way," he growled, a sound so guttural and dangerous that Isabella froze, her mouth hanging open. Sarah burst into the room. The devastation was absolute. Books were torn, toys shattered. In the center of the wreckage, Leo lay curled in a fetal ball, his eyes squeezed shut, his small hands clamping his ears so tightly his knuckles were white. He was hyperventilating, his chest hitching in jagged, painful spasms. Sarah dropped to her knees. She didn't touch him immediately. She knew the protocol. "Leo," she whispered. Her voice was shaky, but she forced it to smooth out. She began to hum. The effect was instantaneous. Leo's body went rigid. He stopped sobbing. He listened. Sarah crawled forward, the wet knees of her scrub pants squeaking on the floor. She ignored the cold dampness. She reached out and placed her palm flat on the floorboards, creating a vibration. "I'm back," she said softly. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving." Leo opened his eyes. They were red-rimmed and terrified, but when he saw her, saw the familiar gray hoodie, the messy hair, the kind eyes, the terror broke. "Sarah!" It was a croak, raw and painful, but it was his voice. He launched himself at her. Sarah caught him, absorbing the impact, wrapping her arms around his small, shaking frame. She rocked him back and forth, burying her face in his hair. "I've got you. I've got you. Breathe with me." In and out. Julian stood in the doorway, water dripping from his hair onto the floor. He watched his son cling to this woman as if she were the only oxygen in the room. He watched Sarah, who had been humiliated and cast out into a storm, hold his child with a love that was fierce and unconditional. He leaned against the doorframe, his legs suddenly weak, and covered his face with his hand to hide the tears that finally fell. The house was quiet now. It was 2 a.m. Leo was asleep, holding Sarah's hand even in his dreams. She had refused to leave his side, sitting in the armchair next to his bed, watching his chest rise and fall. The door creaked open. Julian entered. He had showered and changed into dry clothes, a simple sweater and slacks, but he looked older than he had that morning. He carried a silver tray with a pot of tea and 2 cups. He set the tray down on the side table and stood there, looking at Leo, then at Sarah. "He's stable," Sarah whispered, not letting go of Leo's hand. "His heart rate is normal. He'll sleep through the night." Julian nodded. He looked at her, struggling to find the words. "Sarah." She looked up. Her eyes were tired but guarded. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was waiting to be fired again once the crisis was over. "Isabella is gone," Julian said quietly. Sarah blinked. "Gone?" "I showed her the security footage," Julian said, his voice hard. "I told her she had 10 minutes to pack a bag and leave, or I would have Frank arrest her for grand larceny. She chose to leave." He paused, his jaw tightening. "She never cared about him. She cared about the photo ops. I let that happen. I let her near him." "You were trying to give him a mother," Sarah said gently. "I was trying to fix a problem with a merger," Julian corrected himself bitterly. "I treated my family like a business, and I almost lost the only thing that matters." He took a step closer and knelt by the chair, bringing him to eye level with her. He didn't touch her, respecting her space, but his gaze was intense, stripping away all pretense. "I am so sorry, Sarah, for the accusation, for the way I spoke to you, for making you walk in that rain. I have never felt more ashamed in my life than I did watching you on that monitor." Sarah looked at him. She saw the sincerity in his eyes. She saw the fear he still carried, the fear of a father who didn't know how to parent alone. "I forgive you," she said. And she meant it. Julian let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a new contract," he said. Sarah stiffened slightly. "Mr. Thorne, I don't know if I can—" "It's not for a nurse," Julian interrupted. "I don't want a nurse. I can hire 100 nurses. They can check vitals and dispense pills. I don't need that. Leo doesn't need that." He unfolded the paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note. "Full guardianship rights, partner in care. I want you to help me raise him," Julian said, his voice vulnerable. "Not as an employee who clocks out at 5, as family. I want you to live here, properly. Not in the staff quarters, but in the guest wing. I want you to have a say in his schooling, his therapy, his life. I want you to teach me how to be the father he needs because I don't know how to do it without you." Sarah stared at him. It was an insane proposal. It broke every professional boundary. But then she looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. She looked at Julian, a man who had everything but had nothing until tonight. "I'm not a socialite, Julian," she warned softly, testing the name. "I wear scrubs. I eat cereal for dinner. I don't fit in your world." Julian smiled, a genuine, tired, handsome smile that reached his eyes. "My world was cold and empty until you walked into it, Sarah. I don't want my world anymore. I want ours." Sarah looked back at Leo, squeezed his hand one last time, and then looked at Julian. "Okay," she whispered. Julian reached out and covered her hand with his. "Okay." Epilogue. 1 year later, the sun was shining so brightly it turned the ocean into a sheet of hammered gold. The house was different. It wasn't the cold, imposing Thorne estate anymore. It was a beach house in Malibu, a sprawling structure of warm wood and glass that breathed with the rhythm of the sea. There were no heavy drapes, no silent corridors. The backyard was a chaos of happiness. There were streamers hanging from the palm trees. A massive bouncy castle sat on the lawn. "Higher! Push me higher!" 7-year-old Leo Thorne sat on the swing set, laughing. The sound was clear, loud, and uninhibited. He wore a superhero t-shirt, and his knees were stained with grass. There was no sign of the terrified, mute boy in the tuxedo. Sarah stood on the patio, holding a tray of lemonade. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She wore a simple yellow sundress that caught the breeze. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. She looked healthy, radiant, and at peace. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. She leaned back into the embrace naturally. Julian rested his chin on her shoulder. He was wearing shorts and a polo shirt. No tie, no suit. He looked 10 years younger. "He's loud today," Julian murmured, kissing her cheek. "He's happy," Sarah corrected, turning in his arms to face him. Julian looked down at his wife. They had married in a small, private ceremony 6 months ago. No press, no gala. Just them, Leo, and the justice of the peace. It had been the happiest day of his life. "I got the email from the board," Julian said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "They want me to fly to Tokyo for the summit." "And?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "And I told them I'm busy," Julian grinned. "My son has a birthday party and I promised I'd go in the bouncy castle." Sarah laughed, a bright musical sound that made Leo look over and wave. "You? In a bouncy castle?" she teased. "The dignified Mr. Thorne?" "Mr. Thorne doesn't exist anymore," Julian said, pulling her closer. "Just Dad." "And Julian." He kissed her, deep and slow, oblivious to the caterers setting up the cake. When they broke apart, he looked out at Leo, who was now running across the grass, chasing a golden retriever they had adopted last month. "Thank you," Julian whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "For what?" "For walking home in the rain," he said softly, "and for letting me catch you." Sarah smiled, looking at the family they had built from the wreckage of a storm. "You didn't catch me, Julian," she said, looking at Leo. "We caught each other." Leo shouted from the swing set, "Mum! Dad! Watch this!" They both turned, waving, ready to watch him fly.